builds. And Sonya can give you the numbers on those that we've got in progress. I believe some are coming on this fall as well, going to be completed. It is a time situation. It takes probably 2 years or more sometimes to complete it from the time you start it. And in addition to that, we work with private developers as well. So there's different tools in the toolbox that we use. I think we've looked out probably 3 years, if not more, to where we're going to be and what we think the population is going to be. And to talk to Mr. McNeely's point, we understand where the population is going, what the seniors population is growing, and we have to make sure that we're addressing those situations geographically across all the island.
Okay, thank you. So you issued the 2016-2017 report in 2019. Now, one of the items that the Auditor General wanted to see was performance indicators. Was there changes made in the way that you report annually to identify the performance indicators in the in the annual report to reflect those requests from the Auditor General?
I'd like, Chair, if you don't mind, I'd like to go back to the previous question for 1 second in terms of the plan. And we did issue, went through a very comprehensive process, a co-development team process with our community partners, with developers, with nonprofit organizations. We involved tenants, clients of our program, and issued the Housing Action Plan for Prince Edward Island in July of 2018. And as an interim measure in February of 2020, we did provide an update on that plan. So the Auditor General has agreed with us that that particular recommendation has been completed.
Okay.
Yeah,
So
that's great.
My apologies, but
No, that's okay.
The annual report was issued in 2019. Can you tell me how you've taken the measurable long-term plan and implemented it into the annual report so that you're actually, as they said, measuring performance indicators so that you are showing progress of achieving the plan that's set out?
Yes, so the progress report that was initiated in February of 2020, that was an interim report to identify publicly where we had successes and where we still had work to do on the Housing Action Plan. In terms of our next report related to that plan specifically, it will be rolled into our regular annual reporting process. Since this was February of 2020, we would be looking at, for the March 2020 year end would be our next report a year later, and that would be part of our fiscal year end and annual report at March 2021, sorry.
Okay, thank you. So I find it hard to, part of the mandate of this committee is to hold government to account on action items and recommendations. But I do find it challenging that given the fact that the last annual report was in 2016, 2017, so we're using extremely legacy numbers in order to be able to say, for instance, how many seniors do we still have on the plan? So I know in 2016, 2017, it states that there was 918 seniors on the wait list. And so part of the Auditor General's recommendations is to provide more transparency and accountability so that we can actually discuss, is it still 918 seniors that are on that list? And because to point out, these are seniors that are in vulnerable situations. They are low-income seniors that are probably spending more money on rental today because they're sitting on a waiting list in order to get into seniors housing. So can you tell me what the current wait list number is for the seniors housing program?
So, yeah, I have the red line. We were at the Standing Committee on Health and Social Development a number of weeks ago where we did provide an update on the status of that wait list. At that time, we noted that publicly we were using the number of 1,000, but that we were in the process of contacting our clients on that wait list to get their reassessments up to date. So a couple of things have happened through the summer in terms of typically we would do a reassessment of each client on the registry to ensure that we understand what their needs are. That would happen as close to their anniversary date of applying as possible. through March, April, May, June, we typically would also do a rent review for our existing tenants. So what has happened with that is that their rent review is based on their prior year's income and on their prior year's personal income tax. The Canada Revenue Agency actually gave citizens the opportunity to file their income taxes later into June. So some of the information to complete that process was not available during the normal timeframe. So that got pushed into later in the year. The second thing that happened is that as part of the COVID prevention measures, the province implemented the temporary rental assistance benefit, which we ran between April 1st and closed July 5th, but we also were still cleaning up files into late July and early August. We processed 1,900 applications as part of that benefit, with over 1,650 receiving money to support their rent. So once we closed off the temporary rental assistance benefit program, we returned back to our regular work in terms of the rent reviews and being able to access our Canada Revenue Agency data to update the rent that tenants should be paying. And then we've moved back into our reassessment of the clients on the registry. So we're in the process of getting those numbers up to date now so that we are sure that we understand the amount of need and the type of need. We know from some of the work we've done just in the last couple of weeks that we have clients who've registered or who have applied for that program who have moved on to other housing arrangements. So we have some people that have moved on to community care or long-term care and are no longer asking for support from our program. So we have to continue the process to work through those reassessments so that we have good, strong information.
And just one more question, and then I'm going to move on to another member. So that reassessment, was that triggered by the Auditor General requiring you to have better documentation on clients' files? Was that what triggered that reassessment process?
No, that is part of our regular process to every year do an assessment for the people that are on the registry. Typically, when we meet with clients and collect their information, one of the things that we ask them is that if your circumstances change, please come back and let us know so that we can update your file. Sometimes they don't do that. If you're somebody that's moving on to community care or long-term care, that's probably not the first thing you think of is, oh, I need to call social housing and tell them I don't need a unit any longer, and that's fully understandable. So we make sure that we have that checkpoint at least once a year to say, where are you now? Are you still interested in social housing? Do you have any updates to your file? So that would be part of our regular processes.
Okay, thank you. Sunny?
Thanks, Chair. Just a question for clarification. So, of the 1,000 people that are on your waiting list approximately, would some of those cross over into clients that get support for where they're staying, like the rental settlement and things like that? And you say you contact some of them. Are they contacted on a yearly basis, some of these 1,000 people, or is it just when they come up on the list that you call them and say, where are you at? Do you still need a unit or?
Right. So at a minimum, we would want to contact them on a yearly basis. And when we have a unit or an option available for them, we would be touching base with them to say, okay, we have an option ready for you. What's your status now?
Sunny?
This 1,000 could be 800.
Possibly, yes.
A little higher. Okay.
And we would note that in terms of that, we expect that we will be seeing some people whose circumstances have changed and they're no longer needing our program. We also would note that we have approximately 400 mobile rental vouchers that will be distributing between now and the end of March. We have approximately 100 people on that registry who are living in their own homes. So, we've recommended if they need other services such as Seniors Independence Initiative, or if they need some sort of renovation that would help them remain in their home, if they need their roof repair, we would refer them to our home renovation programs. And if they're having mobility issues, we would also refer them to our Senior Safe at Home program. So we try to connect them with other services that will support them in their own home if that's where they would like to stay. The other piece is that we have approximately 182 units coming online, brand-new units, some of them owned by government, some with our private developer partners, by the end of March. So there's a lot of options coming online in the next upcoming months.
Sunny?
Just one other question. So the seniors that are in their own homes, are you contacting them about the programs that are available, like you say, the independence program and things like that? Or like, are they being reached out to, or are they contacting you?
They can go either way. Like if they have a need, they can identify, but as part of our assessment, when they apply to the program, we look at their current housing conditions, and if we see that there's a repair, we will, we try to have the brochures with us and say, here's the application for this particular program that can help you with your roof. We would also provide referrals to Efficiency PEI as well in terms of, if there's anything that can be done there that would help their housing be more affordable.
Okay, thank you. Gord?
Yeah, thanks a lot. So in the AG's report, they talked about having 13 different lists. How many individuals are on each one of those lists, or is it one great big list, or?
So that was one of the improvements that we worked on very early on with from the Auditor General's recommendations, because it was extremely frustrating to have 13 different lists across the province. All of that data is now in one database where we can pull out information on applicants for the seniors housing program or for the family housing program.
Gord?
So, yeah, you have one list now, and we're still a little bit, we talked about this in the other standing committee, we're still a little bit, worried about that list, so to speak. In the last 2 weeks, what have you done looking at that list between standing committees? I'm just curious to find out.
So staff have been connecting with the applicants on that list. For example, last week alone, there were 43 reassessments completed. The week before, 47. And at the same time as we're doing these reassessments, we would recognize that we may have new applications to the program and clients that have to have those applications looked at as well.
Gord?
So that's good. And I know when we look at this, because it's 2016, there was just kind of more or less the start of the voucher program. So now it's quite accelerated. So I look at housing as one thing and vouchers as another. And the report is, we're looking back in the past. Do you see vouchers being something that we continue? I'm trying to ask non-policy questions, but do you see vouchers as being an important source of dealing with the housing in the future? Action, I guess.
So it is a good tool to have in the toolbox, because it's taking advantage of units that currently exist in the market and that are already meeting the client's needs other than the affordability issue. If you think about it, if you were an applicant on the list and everything was working for you in terms of your home is close to your children's school, it's close to where you work, or it's close to transportation so you can get to work, and then we say, oh, we have a building over here that you have to move into if you want to access our program. But maybe those other things don't work anymore, so it really is a nice fit for some of the clients. As we work through the registry and that reassessment piece, we'll be able to get a better sense in terms of some of those units the clients are in maybe aren't the best fit. They may have issues with repairs. They may not have enough bedrooms to meet the national occupancy standard. And in those cases, then, you do need to have access to newer units, whether it's with other developers in the market or government-owned units.
There was, during the audit, the Auditor General looked at the process of taking people off the list and saw some discrepancies There was, I think, 17 out of a certain amount of cases that people were picked and put into housing when they might have not been supposed to. And that's kind of how I read it in the report. Can you talk a little bit about that and some of the processes you've done to make that process a little bit better?
Sure. And, ideally, you would think that you have a list and everyone's need has been assessed. We assign a point score to that list, and you might look at it and say, okay, we have a unit. Here's Mary's at the top of the list. She has the most points, and she should go in that unit. But you also have to look at the other needs that Mary has. So if Mary is a smoker and that's not a smoking unit, that's not a great fit. If she has a pet and it's not a pet building, that's not going to work either. So we have a team each month that looks at, these are the units that are available, these are the options that are available, and here's the registry and those with the highest amount of points. That team works together in terms of reviewing the needs of the registry and trying to match up the units that are available with those in greatest need. Where I think we fell down a little bit, and admittedly so, is that we need to do a good job of documenting, well, Mary was at the top of the list, why didn't she get that unit? Well, she smokes and she has a pet, and it's a non-smoking building, and it's a non-pet building. We may have had that discussion in our team in terms of making that match, but if you don't document that and show why, then someone else looking at it, they're just going to go, well, you're playing with the list.
Okay, Gord?
So is that a change in your policy since this report, is that you're kind of looking at, if you give somebody a unit, does a committee overlook that and then make the decision and approve it together?
So there was a committee before, and the committee continues. The difference is making sure that the reasoning behind that unit assignment is well documented so that we can explain it to anybody who asks.
Gord?
Okay, no, that's good for now, thanks,
Great.
Jerry.
Okay, thank you. Carla?
Excuse me. I'm just wondering, back to the cost-benefit analysis question that I asked before, is it a normal practice when it comes to expanding or introducing new programs to do a cost-benefit analysis? Is that part of your process?
It typically should be and would be, yes.
Carla?
I'm just going to read a couple of just little sections out of the report and ask a question on them. Excuse me. So section 4.39, it says, management informed us that there is no quality control review process performed on the assessment forms completed by housing officers. Such a review, even on a random basis, could assist in identifying inconsistencies and errors. It would also serve as feedback and guidance to staff and provide assurance that needs are being assessed as intended by policy. Does the department now engage in a quality control review process?
Yes, so our team leads in each of our offices are responsible to review the assessment, review the file that's with the assessment to ensure that the documentation that's there in the file supports the assessment, and they sign off to show their review and that they have taken responsibility for completing that review.
Carla?
Okay. And then there's two more paragraphs here. The division does not have an adequate system for capturing and managing relevant information on program applicants. Important applicant information is obtained at the assessment stage and throughout the waiting period. This information is not maintained in a format that allows for efficient decisions to award units. Management also advised that the department intends to implement policy changes which could impact the wait list. At the date of our audit report, these policy changes were still outstanding. Could you elaborate on what these policy changes would include?
So one of the issues that we tripped over in terms of the registry was that we would have people who applied for social housing but were not ready to actually move into social housing. So there's a perception that the longer I'm on the list, the quicker my name gets to the top. So I will apply now, even though I may not be interested in moving for 3 or 5 years. Initially, those people were allowed to remain on the list. One of the policy changes was that we would have a discussion to assess what their time frame was in terms of actually needing access to the service. And if it wasn't a more immediate need, we would communicate to them that we would hold their application on file. If their circumstances changed in terms of those timelines, to please come back to us and update their information, but that they would not be included on the registry as waiting for social housing.
Carla?
Just kind of sparked something in me. I've heard from a few people who were put on the list because they knew of the wait times and they were trying to be proactive to get on a list. This is just such a huge issue when we look at the number of provincial spaces and the rent sub programs that we do have and the amount of people on the waiting list. A lot of those people are going to be dead before, I know that sounds rude, but I mean, let's be real here. So I have more questions on my list, but and no disrespect intended, what is the long-term plan for this? You know?
Actually, we have a long-term plan, as I alluded to the previous question, is to make sure that we're taking care of the seniors on the list through mobile vouchers, through our capital builds, and through our AHDP programs that we have in place. We have 100+ units coming on here, I think, by the end of the year. 182. That's by March. By March. We've gone through the list, to go back to Mr. McNeely's question, when we're going through the list here in the last 2 weeks. They're going to be over 100 of them placed here by the end of December. Now, these aren't just seniors, this is all inclusive. We know what capital we need to put in place to take care of what's on the remainder on the list, and we know what mobile vouchers will be taken care of, and what we're trying to do is strike a balance between the mobile vouchers, the capital builds, and using AHDP units to ensure that we're covering right across the island. We just opened up units in Surrey, we opened up some in Alberton. We have units coming available in Summerside, in Montague, in Stratford, and in Charlottetown, all within the next 6 months. When we look at the list right now, I'd be quite confident to say that most on those lists will be taken care of in the next year.
Carla?
Wow, I really hope that is reflected in what happens. I'm wondering how the province determines where and how many public housing units it will own and operate.
So part of how we make that decision is related to the registry and where people have identified that they want to live. We also look at what building is going on in terms of starts and completions in the private market. So in terms of what other units may be available, we look at the existing stock of inventory in various communities. So, if you look at somewhere smaller that there might be 1 or 2 landlords that provide units, we might look at government units there. And I think of Morel as one example in terms of we don't have a large landlord population there, but we do have 2 seniors housing buildings and a mixed building on its way shortly. So those would be the things we would look at: what's available in the market, what other developers are doing in the market, and where government needs to fill in the gaps where there is not availability in the market.
Carla?
And another part of the report notes that some applicants with higher scores were passed over for other applicants, often with very little documented reason for doing so, and in some cases with inaccurate information. In some cases, there was nothing to support a decision whatsoever. Can you explain more particularly on what grounds those applicants would have been passed over?
Yes. So when we look at the units that we have available, the options we have available, we also look at the registry, and we do start at the top of the list in terms of the points. However, we have to make sure that the unit that's available matches up with the needs of the client. So as an example, if the person at the top of the list smokes, has a pet, perhaps has accessibility issues, we have to make sure that the unit that's available is a smoking unit, a unit that allows pets, and actually is either on a ground floor or has an elevator that will support the accessibility needs. So I would go back to say where I feel that we fell down was that we didn't do a good job of documenting why the person at the top of the list didn't get that unit that was available.
Carla?
I think that's good for now. Thank you.
Okay. So I'm just I feel like what's really actually missing, we've talked that there is a long-term plan, but there's a lack of performance measurements that the department is working towards. And so I would ask David, I mean, as you're also CEO of PEI Housing Corporation, you've listed significant number of things that you're looking at and all the things that you're doing. But can you list the performance measurements that you think need to be tracked in order for you to be able to hold your department accountable in order to achieve your long-term plan?
What I would suggest is to wait until we present that in mid-November, what the KPIs are, so you can get a full list. We could probably provide the list even probably before that if we needed to, and you get an understanding, because it's been thoroughly vetted through the housing team to make sure that they are the right ones, so that everybody is being held accountable. And again, we do meet weekly to ensure that the list is part of that
Okay.
looked at.
So the report's coming out within weeks. As Deputy Minister, can you please give me a date? So if you're within weeks, can you please give me a firm date in which you will provide that back to the committee?
I can't give you a firm date because I know there's still some work to be done. You might want to allude to, I mean, we're looking in the around middle of November, but you might want to allude to, unless you can give a specific date.
Let's say November 30th.
So, as you know, this House sits on November 12th. One of the recommendations that this committee made back to the Legislative Assembly was to implement all recommendations, which performance measurements was actually one of those recommendations that we went back to the House. In both of our reports, actually, members of this committee agreed upon putting those recommendations as achieving 100%. So up until the most recent meetings that you had with the Auditor General, the performance measurements were outstanding. They were not, you admit that those were not something that you had actually developed at that point in time. So is there a way that you can ensure that that report will be tabled while this House is sitting, in which we sit on November 12th? Will you commit to that date, to a date that we're sitting, so that it can actually be discussed in this House?
So I'd like to actually see it sooner than that date, but
I
I
would
think it
too.
would be, I'd almost want to say that we'll under-promise and over-deliver, but I can't really say that when we're talking about a 17-18 report. That's certainly not.
You haven't over-delivered,
Exactly.
absolutely.
What I would note is that in prior reports, we did have performance indicators in those reports, and we can't, honestly, we can't say that we're reporting publicly because we haven't updated the report since. So as part of our process with our KPI side is to look at what we were previously reporting, see if that's still relevant, and then layer in anything new that is relevant.
Okay. The last point I would just like to make, so in this House on November 28th, we did pass an act to amend the Housing Corporation Act that allowed the PEI Housing Corporation to go out for an external auditor, and you've confirmed that you have appointed that external auditor. Can you tell me what the timelines that have been set out with that external auditor to deliver the audited financials back to you for all of the years that have been delinquent to date?
I don't have that in front of me. Our finance department would have done the contract in terms of laying out the exact timeline. So I know that it is this fall into late December, which is why I say January would be our date in terms of trying to release the next 18, 19, and 19, 20 reports.
Because as you stated, you can't actually deliver the 2018-19 and 2019-2020 reports until you have those audited financials. Are you able to obtain those dates so that we have a better idea as when we can see those updated annual reports? And the last thing is, so the Financial Administration Act in Section 70, it indicates that any reporting entity has to deliver its audited financial reports by a specific date after the fiscal year closes. At this point in time, as we are fast approaching, and you've actually changed your fiscal year to December 31st, correct? No?
No,
So it's still March 31st?
it's still March 31st.
Will you be able to meet that March 31st date?
So for our March 31st, 2021 year end, which
Yeah.
would be the next one that is due, that should be completed by the end of June 2021. That would be our goal.
Okay. And is your goal to also produce, because within 6 months after the close of your fiscal year, the Financial Administration Act states that you are also to follow up with an annual report. Will you be meeting that timeline set out by the Financial Administration Act?
That would be our goal.
Okay. I don't have any further questions. Does anybody have any questions? Ola?
Thank you, Chair. I think it's really good news that you're going to make a significant dent in the backup list in the coming year when new units are coming online. And I also understand that it takes several years to get projects going. The one thing that doesn't take any advance time is the vouchers, basically where you subsidize. Is your department committed to basically clean up the waiting list to zero by just issuing more? What's the limitation that you have currently and will have in the future on the issuing of vouchers?
I think the limitation right now is we have a certain allocation in the budget for vouchers, certain allocation for capital bills. And as we go forward again, we go through the capital process every year, and we go through the budget every year to decide what we need. We put an ask in, and then that is returned to us with what we have. We're making sure that we're measuring it very closely. We're quite confident, again, as I said, in the next year that we'll be able to make a significant dent into that wait list. And then we have to see how how many more people come onto the wait list as you're taking them off. So it's kind of a fluid process as you go year to year. But I would say over the next 12 months, we're quite confident that we're in good shape.
Ola?
Thank you.
Okay. Any other further questions? Did you have a closing remark or anything that you'd like to share, or anything that you'd like to leave us with?
I'm good. No, fine.
Okay, thank you. So just before we close, I do know that Carla had made a request for a cost-benefit analysis to be tabled with the committee. All the members are you all in favor of that? Yeah? And is there any other items? So I had requested that a firm date be provided for the 2017-2018 report. Is the committee fine with that? Okay. Additional follow-ups on this? Gordon?
Add to it, I'd like to see some firm dates about the future reports too, after the 2017, 2018, 2019, like when we can expect those to be ready.
Is the committee in agreement with that? Okay. So firm dates on, that would be the audited financials as well as the annual reports. And any other follow-ups that we'd like to capture? Okay, thank you. So did I catch everything, Ryan? Yeah. Okay. I'd like to thank you very much for coming in, and we look forward to, I guess, next AG report for 2021 will be your second follow-up, so that's 4 years after the initial performance audit. The Auditor General will follow up, so we look forward to seeing, of course, the information brought back to the committee that has been requested, but also the Auditor General's report on that follow-up as well. So thank you very much. We'll take a short recess, and then we'll reset for our next guests. Thank you. All right, we are going to move on to item number 4 on our agenda. And so with us now we have people from members from the Department of Finance to go over the economic and fiscal update that was submitted at the end of September. So we have Nigel Burns. Nigel's going to go first. He's going to provide a fiscal update. Nigel is the Director of Economic Statistics and Federal Fiscal Relations. And Gordon MacFadyen will follow up with the economic update. And Gord is the Assistant Secretary to the Treasury Board. And so I'll hand it over. I know you have a presentation, so I'll hand it over to you, gentlemen, and you take it away.
So we'll reverse the order. I'll do the economic
Oh, I'm
update
sorry.
first.
Economic, then finance, sorry.
Okay.
Thank you, fiscal update. Okay.
So, I'll just start. These documents were tabled with the legislature at the end of September and were available from the government website as well. But just to go over the highlights from the economic update, we can start with a little bit of a retrospective on where we were coming into the pandemic. PEI was in very good economic shape coming into the pandemic. We were in the midst of a very strong sustained economic expansion. We had real economic growth in 2019 measured at 4.5%. This was it led the country. But it was the 12th straight year of growth in the island economy. It was the 5th year in a row where we exceeded the national average. And for the second year in a row, second consecutive year, we led the country in the rate of economic expansion. So we were on a very solid path. Coming into the pandemic, we were, the first part of 2020 was, again, continuing this momentum of very strong growth. But then, as you can see, starting in March, when we look at the employment levels here, mid-March, the situation started to turned very sharply, and public health mandates and orders came into effect, which shut large swaths of the economy and displaced a lot of workers. And we see that here, particularly in April, which was really the bottom of it when things were closed kind of as tight as they were. And then subsequent to that in May, when some seasonal industries kind of get back up and running, fishing, farming, we can see a rebound. Also goes along with some relaxation of the public health orders. Mm-hmm. So we're on a path of recovery from a very sharp, which was understood to be the most severe, widespread, and sharpest contraction in modern times. The impact on labor was quite severe, but it was also its impacts have been mixed across industries. Some industries have seen fairly mild impacts or relatively shallow downturns and quickly got back up to some sense of normal. You can see construction, which if I could show, it's kind of in the middle there. It's the kind of the maroon-ish color. Kind of a dip in April, but the industry figured out how to accommodate, can keep the businesses going, keep projects under construction, keep people employed, and return to some level of kind of normal in construction industry very quickly. We see some sharp contractions in healthcare and social assistance, but then getting back fairly quickly to normal. When you get down to the near the bottom of this chart on the left, you'll notice it's the accommodations and food service sector, which took a fairly precipitous drop in employment and has been relatively slow to rebound. And that's people are reluctant to, when they were closed, and people have been reluctant to go back to these areas, and the industry has been slower to recover. When we turn to the chart on the right, while we know that the impacts of the pandemic on employment by industry has varied, its impact on genders have also been varied fairly considerably. For males, in both cases, fairly sharp contraction in employment, but for males it was more shallow and resulted in a fairly steep rebound, whereas for females the decline was much more pronounced and has been slower in the rebound. And part of that is attributed to female participation in certain industries that were more affected by the public health orders and those shutdowns. We've done a little further work on this area to understand a little more the breakdown on the gender impacts. Women across the board generally more impacted than males, but youth, so workers, young workers just starting the labor market, still much more impacted than the rest. And for kind of your core aged working male population, 25 to 54, actually they've fully recovered. So they've gotten all they're now higher than pre-pandemic levels of employment. So I've kind of gone through this period of sharp contraction, and just to revisit a little bit of where we thought we would be very early in the pandemic, as illustrated by the dashed line, that's where we originally thought employment would track. As it turns out, it wasn't as bad as we had thought, so the impact was slightly less. Businesses kind of figured out how to reopen or keep some part of their businesses operating during the pandemic, and resulted in a lower contraction, and in the early part of the pandemic, a quicker rebound. But since then, it has been slower. So during the summer, we thought we would be kind of getting back to closer to normal, but that hasn't materialized. We've made a lot of the gains back from the depth of the shutdowns, but there's still a ways to go. And it's really that accommodation and food service area that is noticeably down in employment. But it is good to know that some of the fundamentals of the island economy are still strong. We've received new population data for the province, which continues to show PEI having a healthy growth in the population, just short of 160,000, which was a target anticipated to be met by the end of 2022. We're likely to meet that target by the end of this year. From July 1st, 2019 to July 1st, 2020, population grew by 1.5%. Actually, that's a little slower than the more recent years, but it's still very strong. It's among the provinces, it led the country, second only to Nunavut, the territory. So we think growing population has a fairly strong impact on the rate of growth of the island economy, and probably is contributing to about 1.5% growth to the underlying growth in the economy, which will help with the recovery. And at the same time, there's been extraordinary supports being put in place to support people and businesses during the pandemic. We highlight a number of them this is by no means an exhaustive list, but it was trying to draw attention to the level of benefits that were offered through the various federal programming, which rolls up to somewhere in the order of, within the 6 months of the pandemic, something approaching $580 million. Principally, the largest of that going to the Canada Emergency Response Benefit, an amount that that program is now kind of rolled over into a suite of new programming, which is the Recovery Benefit, a new EI program, and caregiver benefit, and a sick leave provision. So those, so the CERB, as understood, is basically behind us now. Canada Emergency Wage Subsidy continues and will continue well into next year. It's very strong uptake by the business community and has helped businesses provide the confidence to open the doors, because it takes one of the main pressures of one of the larger expenditure lines in opening is labor. And the rest, not to go through them, but have been important supports to both people and business. And that support has helped cushion the blow and preserve people's ability to, coming out of the pandemic and the restrictions being lifted, would have some money to kind of go back about their business. We did see, when the restrictions were lifted, very sharp rebound in retail sales in June. July kind of pulled back a little bit, but since then the more recent data has kind of shown it's kind of back. We're back above previous levels. So people could only do that if they had money. So trying to avoid the public health crisis turning into a personal and corporate financial crisis, those measures were necessary. But overall, there's been some pretty dramatic impacts on retail. It was down about 25% in April and is in the process of recovering. Among the provinces, we've seen, at least the data up until July, PEI was on the kind of the milder levels of impacts. And this is one area that we're monitoring quite closely, as it is an important barometer of economic activity, but also revenues for the province. And part of that is one of the hallmarks of this downturn and recovery is its impacts have been not even. In the retail space, certain types of stores have done remarkably well during the pandemic. General merchandise stores have seen an increase in business, along with food and beverage stores, your grocery stores. People have eaten less at restaurants and are rediscovering the joys of cooking at home. But during this, to counterbalance that, you see that motor vehicle and parts dealers, it was very difficult to buy a car early in the pandemic, as all these places were closed. You can't go for test drives. Although that has turned around in the recent months, and it's been very healthy sales in that space. Just turning to one of the bright spots in the island economy throughout the pandemic and part of the recovery has been construction. To the middle of the year, investment in construction increased, actually year over year, on top of a record year for construction in the province. It grew by 7.3%. Housing starts increased by 13% through the middle of the year. And the Real Estate Association on PEI has been saying it's been a very strong year for sales in PEI.
Yeah.
So, and we've seen that year over year increase in value and very strong volumes coming out of the pandemic. Turning to the primary industries, farming has seen the first 6 months of the year actually on a record-setting year for the farm cash receipts. Although we're aware that drier growing conditions this summer may have impacted yields on the potato crop, still, most of the crops in now. Bit of a mixed result across the province, but we'll wait till agriculture tells us what more about the harvest. But for the dry crops, dry growing season has been kind of a benefit for the quality of grains and soybean crops, we understand. Turning to fisheries, this was a really difficult spring season for the lobster fisheries. There were concerns about would there be enough market to go out and fish. Delays in the opening of the season, which impacted landings. But by the time we got to the end of the season, the markets had opened up and product had moved. Prices weren't as good as recent years, but overall, a fairly decent spring season. And we understand from the fall season, it might go down as a record in terms of landings, and prices being better than they were in the spring. In terms of tourism, it's been a difficult and very challenging year for that industry. Accommodations, fixed roof accommodations have been having made some difficult business decisions this year. Occupancy rates are way down, and public health orders that restrict people's travel and ability to, not just within the bubble, the Atlantic bubble has helped, but it's really the travelers from outside of the bubble that really account for the majority of overnight stays. And we see that both in overnight stays being well down of a normal year. We also see it in food and beverage restaurant sales as well, down pretty near 25% through the first, a little more than the first half of the year. Manufacturing has held up reasonably well. PEI is, while in decline, at about 5%. PEI's manufacturing industry is dominated by food industries, which holds up really well, kind of regardless of the economic circumstance. People need to eat, and the products we've dominated by our staples in that regard. So there's been some challenges, as we understand. There's been some layoffs in the aerospace sector. That hasn't really been reflected in the data thus far, but we're expecting it to be kind of a softer latter half of the year in that industry. And exports have held up reasonably well for the first half of the year or so. But the remainder of the year with aerospace, it could tip the tide on that one as well. But for the first half of the year, PEI had held up relatively well in comparison to other provinces. So as we learn more about the impacts of the pandemic on the economy, what does seem to be clear is that early on there was wide divergent views on its impacts, and on average being about a negative 5% impact for 2020 for PEI. This is it's still not a great situation. Everyone is predicting a contraction, but it's things are starting to tighten up and be less of an impact for the year. And that partly sets up for a slower since we don't have such a big contraction, we won't have as strong a rebound in the following year. But that's okay. We have less destruction in the first place to heal in the second year. So we're looking at just under 4% contraction this year, followed by a 3.8% rebound or recovery in 2021. So just to summarize and kind of conclude the economic part, for the outlook, we are still of the view that employment should continue to strengthen as we kind of work our way through what is the new normal. Since October is the new normal, and we don't see a second wave causing further shutdowns in the province. And as September was really the month when daycares could open to full capacity and schools would return to in-school teaching, that would have, it was anticipated would have an impact on female participation rate in the labor market, who might have been out of the labor market due to child caring or caregiving responsibilities. We think that, we understand that immigration will continue at near pre-COVID levels, so not in full measure, but still fairly strong level of immigration that will support growing economy. And we've got some clarity on the federal income supports for at least the foreseeable future, well into the new year, which will help support islanders, people and businesses affected by the pandemic, so that they're able to preserve some ability to support themselves when work is unavailable. And all of this outlook is really contingent on keeping the case counts low in the province here, but also with our trading partners, our sister provinces in the region and right across the country. Getting this under control is really what needs to happen to really get a full economic recovery back on track. And that's it. So,
Okay.
do we want to just?
I think we thought Gord would go next because Gord's doing the fiscal side of it, and then we can combine questions for both of them at the end, if that's okay with the committee. Okay, so we're going to do a quick reset as they change over. Oh. All right, we will continue on with Gordon MacFadyen for the fall fiscal update. Thanks, Gord.
Good morning, and thank you for the opportunity to provide a little bit of information on the finances for the province. It doesn't seem like that long ago we were sitting in here talking about the budget, and it's probably for good reason because it's not that long ago. But it has been a busy season for the finance staff, and I'd just like to highlight on a couple of the projects that we've been working on. As had been indicated in the past, we had kind of 2 iterations of the budget leading into this year. We had one pretty well ready to go before the pandemic hit, and I think when all was said and done, I think it was a good idea not to race it out the door and, like other provinces, have a picture that was not going to come true whatsoever. Take the time back and reset in June and bring back what we thought at that time a more representative picture of where we think the 2021 fiscal year will be. I will say it is challenging in that this new normal, we don't have a lot of data points in our rear view mirror to be basing projections and basing any like future outcomes on, so it will be a challenging time for the finance staff. So as well, we kind of updated, obviously, the fiscal updates for 1920 a couple of times to try to get a forecast for the year that was. We prepared this fall fiscal update. We are in the middle of, right now, almost getting the final touches on a capital budget that will be coming in a couple of weeks with the opening of the new session of the legislature. And last week, we actually sent out the call letters to departments for next year's operating budget. So we kind of have a lot of balls in the air here right now, and I'd like to thank the kind of finance folk for keeping things moving along. The request from Motion 81 is a little unique for us, not in that providing a fall fiscal update's not unique, but the timing of it was a little unique in that to have it ready for September, we really can't wait till September is concluded, which would be the halfway point of the fiscal year. We kind of had to base it on results a little bit earlier, and for most departments, they could get it up to the end of August. For health, with a big infrastructure over there, they had to kind of shut it down even a little bit earlier than that to try to get a barometer of where they're at. So traditionally, we would be bringing a fall fiscal update into the House in November when the House sits with a full 6 months under our belt. Now, 5 months, we can still do a reasonable check, but given the year that was, it's only a few months down the road from when we set the budget. So, spoiler alert, the results are not all that different than what we had laid out in the budget. So, with that, we'll kind of just go forward. Next there. So, when we met with you in June, we presented and were kind of describing a budget deficit for the province of $172.7 million. After receiving the input back from departments and taking a look at the revenues a few months later on down the road, we had indicated that we think we're kind of on track, very close to that 172.7. So we're off by about 5.4 million, which is a big number in itself, but when you start looking at, we're a $2.3 billion revenue machine. So the 5.4 million, not saying it's rounding because it's real money, but we're very close. But that's not to kind of underscore the size of the deficit to begin with. That just means that we're still in the ballpark where we were in June, which is not surprising given we're only a couple of months down the road. We will, with the budget document that's coming in February, have a third quarter forecast as well, and that'll be our next true public reporting, I believe, of where the province's finances are for the current fiscal year. So I'll kind of lever it down. So the high level results were obviously a 5.4 million off of what we thought the overall forecast would be. That within there is revenues and expenses. Obviously, revenues we think we're going to be down a little bit as well, and correspondingly the expenses are also down. It can be a kind of a bad news situation if revenues go down and expenses go up. That would put a little distance in the deficit. I'd note that the federal revenues are a little bit softer than we had projected, and I'll get into that a little bit more specifically. I have a slide on federal revenues. Provincial revenues are also a little softer. The one bright light in this is our government business enterprises, lotteries, PI Liquor Commission, Cannabis Corporation, so those business entities that kind of recoup their money from sales. We kind of caught lotteries at the low point when we did the budget. They were still shuttered. We had no plan on when they were coming back, so the information that we had received from ALC that it was going to be a very, very tough year. We have opened some restaurants that have VLTs, and some of the lottery products and the lottery sales, ticket sales have continued to be strong. So where we would have presented a budget of around $700,000 profit for the year, we're seeing that coming back a little better with almost we're forecasting about a $6 million profit for the Lotteries Corporation, up substantially from what was reported in the budget. The story for the PEI Liquor Commission, which would be the other big entity in there, is up just marginally at another 1.6 million. So that kind of comprises the revenue from the government business enterprises. Turning over to the what's changed in the federal revenue, and this has kind of come up a couple of years in a row now. The big driver on this is our infrastructure revenue being received under some of the programs that the federal government sponsors. So we're showing that revenue related to infrastructure to be off by almost $32 million, and that's a function of projects that we would have set up to get done and funded through our partners, municipalities and other groups that aren't just going to get, they don't think they're going to get them done. So we'll also have some corresponding expenditure decreases in the same area. So net, it's kind of a no effect on the budget, but we're not going to collect these revenues from the federal government, and we're not going to be spending, but as well, we're not going to be getting projects done, which is the downside of not having any activity in this particular area. As well, we had a couple of slowdowns due to COVID. Our health department had a couple of big projects on the go for EMR rollout and some Access Atlantic initiatives for access to health information. They had to pivot their department and entity to doing COVID tasks, so there was not the staff around to kind of carry out some of the activities. So we as well had some expenditure not being incurred and some revenue unable to be collected. And on the bright side, we had set up about $74 million in COVID-related revenues from the federal government, and I think we're going to be a little bit more than that with the last couple of announcements that come around after the budget had been passed. So we'll be up about $6 or almost $7 million in additional revenue there. On the provincial side, as Nigel had indicated, their business is not kind of coming back as quick as we would have liked. We're showing, based on preliminary information being received from Finance Canada, our sales tax being off by about $12 million from what we had budgeted there. Corporate income tax is going to be down as well. But what's interesting, the personal income tax we're actually going to see, I think, a little better than we had thought, because of as the slide, as Nigel indicated, some of these CERB, or the Canadian Emergency Response, and the continuation. I think personal income tax will be relatively strong for us over the next fiscal year. Just a little more detail on the expenses, and I tried to highlight on some of the departments that had the larger variances, and this kind of goes in conjunction with the revenue being off. Infrastructure grants out to recipients are going to be off by about $27 million, and we had some additional uptake in efficiency PEI programs. They're rolling out their solar and a few other programs there, the heat pumps, and the other three are sort of people-related activity. The building maintenance, obviously we had some retrofits to a lot of the buildings across PEI. We have a large fleet of buildings and trying to get safe workplaces back. And the highway maintenance division, that would be mostly people on the ground, boots on the ground, assisting a lot of departments on a number of fronts. Health and wellness took the kind of brunt of through the CPHO. We tried to get, at the time of the budget, a good estimate of where they were going to go with their Operation Isolation and the PPE stockpile that they're maintaining. So they're projecting to be overspent by about $8.7 million based on the budget we set up for them. And the variances are, as noted, PPE about 4.2, and then about 3.5 in Operation Isolation. So we'd hoped that would kind of be winding down, but with the second wave arrival, we're holding our own, and they think the CPHO believes the strong border measures are keeping our case counts low, and they want to keep going with that. Interesting enough, we did set up a contingency, so they're drawing down on their contingency. They're one of the first departments to kind of come in and draw down on that. We're hopeful that if the PPE is not expended by the end of the year, we don't need it. We kind of got a stockpile of it, as was seen early on in the pandemic. Trying to get your hands on masks and gloves and face shields and gowns was problematic. So there was groups that worked hard to secure supply chains for those. We bought a lot and it's sitting in a warehouse right now. So if it's still kind of in a warehouse at the end of the year, it's not an expense, but an inventory item. So we're kind of keeping an eye on that, whether or not that will turn into an expense for the current fiscal year. But we've got it sitting offsetting on their contingency right now. For education and lifelong learning, the back to school and the safe restart to school, they were in early as well with their plan and their funding projections on some additional staff that was going to be required for monitoring students and additional cleanings. I think there's a few bus routes that went on. So they came forward with their plan. The early childhood sector came with a plan for their safe restart. Holland College came in as well with a safe restart plan. All that to say that we had set them up early on with a $6 million contingency. That was backstopped when we flushed out the safe restart agreement with the federal government. There wasn't as large an allocation within the base agreement, but they came with a supplementary agreement, so we set them up with the $14 million in that department for contingency on safe restart for them. So they're about halfway through that right now. So in the finance in the general government, as you'll recall, we set up a fairly healthy contingency for the first round of COVID programs within general government. So that was sort of our $75 million that we had talked about in the spring of the year. And right now we're showing most of those programs are about 75% concluded. We think we have enough money in that bucket, and right now showing a small surplus of unspent funds in the first round of the general contingency. And they're noted there, some of the programs that weren't quite at the potential of the budget that we'd set up for them. As well, we're showing a few salary savings, and what's interesting, our interest charges on debt throughout this, and with our strong sort of credit ratings and the work that we've done in the past, we'd kind of set up a level of interest rate on our debt for, we have about $128 million in debt service costs for the province. Our short-term program, we're almost seeing some all-time lows in that area, so which is good news. We're not paying out interest, but bad news, we still have debt. So we're just, it's a little bit lower than we would have kind of seen right on the upfront. So that would be sort of an overall description of the departments with the large variances. This was included in the document that was tabled in the fall there, and this is just a sort of a department by department review of all the variances. When we do a forecast, we disperse out to all the departments, kind of tell us what you think, what's going on out there. I'm responsible for collecting all that information, boiling it up, does it make sense, does it hang together, and come up with an overall forecast for all the revenue and expense. But the individual sort of variances is very much a departmental sort of initiative, because they're the ones that get the money to spend, not the Department of Finance. So that's just the second half of the departments. You note the two large ones there, general government, which we had talked about, and transportation. That's the final run, the interest on debt charges. So, and just to kind of conclude, the story is not a huge surprise that we're close to our budget targets, and that's kind of a function of we're not that far off establishing the budget. We had a tremendous amount of work that went into producing the initial run of projections. The fall fiscal update would kind of solidify most of the assumptions that went into the budget document. As the year falls out, we'll know more, obviously, and we'll be bringing back that information when it becomes available. Thank you.
Great. Thank you both for your updates, and I just want to, before we open it up for questions, say I appreciate the efforts the Department of Finance has gone through in the last 6, 8, 12 months. I know it has been a lot of pressure on the department in order to try to capture what this whole pandemic looks like for the province, and so I'd just like to express my appreciation to everybody for really digging in and doing that extra work, because it's very valuable information that you've provided for us and for Islanders. So I want to say thank you, and please pass that on to your staff. So I have Gord on the list first.
Thank you very much for this update. There's a lot there, and I appreciate you coming in. I know you're busy. A few things. In the fiscal update, there was no data for the following government enterprises: CADC, PI Cannabis Management, PI Energy Corporation. Why was that the case?
In the document that would have been presented and tabled with the legislature, there is some variance information within that particular document. I didn't highlight it today because they're mostly on track. I tried to keep my remarks to the things that were off. The plan is not as the plan was presented. So if variances kind of come up on those particular entities as the months kind of wind down, we'd be reporting on them specifically in a third quarter forecast or something like that.
Gord?
The fall fiscal update stated that, and I think you'd mentioned this before, and the government business enterprises show an increase of $6.9 million due to a better than anticipated local sales and interprovincial activity. The provincial budget from June estimated only $700,000 in revenues from lottery commissions. However, the fall fiscal update indicated revenues of $5.3 million. That's quite a big variance. Was brought up to the province so far this year. Can you confirm that the majority of the $6.9 million increase referred to what was a result of increased lottery purchases?
Yes. As I indicated earlier in my presentation, when we prepared the budget document, we would rely a lot on the Atlantic Lottery Corporation as the operator of the lottery games and activities within Atlantic Canada, not just for Prince Edward Island. So, and at the time that our budget document was being prepared, we didn't have a runway as to when we would get back to operations for the VLTs and for the Racino and for, we just started harness racing, it just started up. And the ticket sales had been going all along, but they were, because a lot of them are in-person sales, they were challenged with actually getting out. So it's more of a function of, it was a worst case scenario if we kind of didn't open, because we had no plan at the time of the budget development for opening. And it was just a short time, actually, we kind of tabled the budget, that we ended up with our opening up of restaurants in particular, where a lot of the activities are taking place on PEI. So, and how quick they go back is a little bit unknown at that time. And as I'd indicated, we don't have a lot of data points in our rear view mirror for how to model some of the activity related to the pandemic. We're learning more every day, but we sort of picked, and based on the advice of Atlantic Lottery, a number that they would suggest that was going to be profits retained for the province. And even as of September, those have improved.
Gord?
Yeah, I was just thinking about, like, is it a sufficient indicator of a healthy and robust economic recovery when we're looking at numbers like that? You'd mentioned that $1.6 million we were up slightly in liquor sales. Was that, I just had trouble here. Yeah. So we don't have, the tourism numbers are dropped dramatically, but liquor sales are up 1.6 million. Is that?
Well, to be fair, I'm just kind of going from my notes here. That would be a net increase on what we thought at the budget time. Overall sales are down for the PEI Liquor Commission, because we didn't have Rock the Boat, we didn't have Cavendish Beach Music Fest. We had a lot of festivals, events that didn't happen. Just for a reference, our prior year budget for liquor for 1920 was 21.7 million in net profits. We budgeted 12.3 in the 2021 budget. So that's a fairly significant decline, like $9 million. So at our forecast time, we're marginally higher than our budget, back up into about 14 million. So down from last year, for sure, but up from what we had budgeted based at the time.
Gordon?
In the government's COVID response document on page 19, it states that a total of $208 million was allocated to the property tax deferral program. However, in the previous year, the province only took in $128 million in property tax, and that's on page 16 of the budget. How is that there is almost an additional $80 million in property tax deferred than paid for the 2019-20 year?
Within the realm of property tax, we collect on behalf of municipalities as well and on behalf of the Island Waste Management Corporation. So what's on your property tax bill would represent the provincial share, the municipal share, fire dues for that matter, and the charges for the Island Waste Management Corporation. So in total, Islanders would receive approximately $208 million in tax bills, of which 120 some odd million, as you'd indicated, comes directly for provincial property tax. We remitted and we stayed whole to IWMC and to the municipalities and the fire district. So we didn't receive the money from the taxpayers, but we still paid all the municipalities for their taxes owed. So that's the difference between the 208 and the 128 that you referenced, is the share of municipal taxes, IWMC charges, and fire dues that are contained on your tax bill.
Gord?
You'd mentioned too that Nigel mentioned too that the impact was slightly less but slower. With COVID, does this allow for future more targeted support for Islanders in the future? I'm thinking of the restaurant industry, the aerospace industry. I mean, we're starting to see some maybe some people who did really well, like the construction industry, and the variance is there. Because it was slower or slightly less, is there going to be more funding? Are we going to be able to support small industries that got hit the hardest?
I'll take a first run at it. Intertwined within the 2021 budget, we kind of established a $65 million contingency for second wave activities. We forecast that to be spent in here, although the uptake is still coming in. So we didn't kind of take it off the table and say our forecast and our deficit will be down, because there's no indication today that there will be some additional supports. I think government set up that contingency for second wave with that very thought in mind. We don't know what we know we're going to need yet, but as it's required, I believe as the programs are required, I think we have some funding to support that.
Gord?
And I know that money went out, like for example, we talked about education receiving money and they're spending it. But what happens if departments don't use their contingency fund? Is that money, can that be allocated to other areas that are more in need, or other departments?
For sure. As money is voted in the legislature to a particular ministry, if they don't spend it, the FAA would indicate that lapses for them. But if there are other requirements for another department that's beyond their fiscal capacity as presented to the legislature, if the legislature sits, we'd bring in a supplementary appropriation for you to take a look at. If the legislators are not sitting, we would process a special warrant for that, and that gets reported back to the legislature. So I guess the answer would be yes, that if the need is there, I think that there are capacity for that need to be met.
Gord?
Thank you, Chair. I'll pass.
Thank you. Carla?
I just have a few questions here. Nigel, could you clarify something for me? When you were talking about employment rates, did you say that women and youth were removed from something?
Maybe just to clarify, so we've done additional work to better understand the impacts by gender and by age ranges. So we noticed that the pandemic has had a more severe impact for females across the board, young females, core-aged females, and older worker females. For males, it's a little different story. For the core-aged 25 to 54, they've recovered to pre-pandemic levels. Older males have very good, have recovered mostly there. For the younger males and females have fared much worse out of this. As in the case with just about every recession, they have lowered attachment to the labor force. The most recent hire, for a whole host of reasons why their circumstance might not have been as strong a rebound.
Carla?
Thank you for that. And one of the reasons I ask, obviously, just the trend that we're seeing on a national level of, as following the data coming out, particularly like you said, the youth and women in general, it's just been really fascinating as we followed it along. And one of the trends we're seeing now on a national level is women leaving their jobs, not because of the lack of childcare or schools being open, but the stress, the guilt, the time away from family, the pressures now of unpaid labor, the meal prep and all of those things. It's getting to be a lot. And so it shows that, that women are not going to recover from this for years to come. And I'm sure you've heard of the phenomenon, I guess we'll call it, the she economy, and saying that this is putting women back, not only economically, but in women's rights ways, setting us back years. And so I think I was happy to see it divided up like that, and it's really important that we always keep that in mind, especially as we consider the hit that accommodations and food service took, because that does employ mostly women, as do a lot of the 5 C's, cooking, cleaning. I can't remember them all off the top of my head. I was listening to a podcast the other day. So it's just very, very concerning and really needs to be at the forefront as we consider rebuilding. So just kind of a little comment there. My second question, you already answered in that. My third question. So as we consider immigration and hoping to get our immigration numbers back up, I'm just wondering, I've kind of heard rumblings here and there, but as we consider kind of what COVID changes have reflected and our new realities, is there plans to adjust our immigration programs to reflect that, so that as we rebuild the economy, we are doing so thoughtfully and where we've kind of identified all of our gaps, and then we're kind of adjust our immigration policies or programs to reflect that?
I'm not an expert in that policy area, but in our discussions with the department that is responsible for that area, we understand that the levels of immigration will pick back up as they've changed kind of the programming for immigration. It's very much now a program tied to labor needs. So it's much more dynamic in reacting to the needs of the labor market to fill skills gaps where they exist. So that connecting the labor market needs with what the department is going to be prioritizing, it's a much tighter link between those two.
Carla?
It's really great to hear. And Gord, I'm going to jump over to you and just kind of something that you said that kind of sparked something in me, and fully understanding this is not a reflection of anything that you mean. But just hearing you say, and correct me if I'm wrong, but that the VLT machine numbers were high, there was a huge increase?
Compared to what we had put in the budget. So what we get, at the time that we were preparing the budget, the whole activities of ALC, other than almost online ticket sales and whatever counter sales they had, were shuttered. So we didn't really see a path forward with any reasonable certainty at that point in time to kind of put it forward in a budget document. Since the time that the budget was prepared, obviously activities have recommenced. They're not at levels where they had been in the past, but they have rebounded past what we would have established in the budget.
Carla?
Thank you. And then there was another comment about personal income tax and the projection of that being quite large as a result of CERB and people having to pay that back. While this is not new, it's particularly concerning during the recovery of a pandemic that it sounds as though our hopeful financial status relies a lot on the backs of our most vulnerable people. And as we consider recovery plans across the world, particularly the ones that have a feminist recovery lens, they're saying that, you know, we shouldn't be building on the backs of people, that we should be building bridges to equity. And so that's kind of, I guess, not so much a question, again, not reflective of your beliefs, but just a concern that I have moving forward based on the information presented today. I do have two questions for you, Gord. I'm wondering if you could, and this may be out of your scope, but I'm wondering if you could speak to a little bit the health and wellness projects that were kind of put on the back burner as we redeployed some of our health workers, department workers.
Yeah, one of them was we were building and working through a contract for electronic medical record. So we had put an RFP out a number of months ago, and sort of we were in the final stages of negotiation with the provider on the particular contract for that. So we were set back a little bit on that. That is continuing on. Both items were contained in last year's capital budget. And they will be again included in the capital budget in a kind of a reconstituted format for the actual activities for the two projects. It's, as we discussed a couple of times, it's the revenue goes in the operating budget and the work gets done in the capital because there's a lifespan beyond a year for these systems. So it's kind of will show up in two places. So we'll have a good chance to talk about both of them when the capital budget gets presented because they're still active projects.
Okay.
It's just the timing is not quite there.
Carla?
Thank you for that. My last question, so for the contingency fund spending on education, could you kind of speak to that a little bit? You said we were at $7 million. I'm just wondering.
Yeah. What the plan brought forward by education for accessing their contingency fund was about $5.1 million for the safe restart of schools. So they laid out some kind of technology that was going to be required, the number of personnel that were going to be required, the number of supplies that were going to be required to open up in a safe manner. So that was about $5.1 million. Similarly, early childhood sector came forward with a plan as well, mostly related to the same personnel and supplies for safe operations within the early child and daycare centers across PEI. And there was a small amount for Holland College on the same. So the process that we had established when we set these contingency funds were that departments, once the activities were identified that were not contemplated at the time of the budget but appeared, and the safe restart of schools was a good one. We didn't know really what that would look like in June, but we knew it would happen. Well, they completed it, they costed it, they brought it into Treasury Board, and the plan was approved and funds were released to the department from their contingency fund.
Okay. Carla, you
Yeah,
have one more,
yeah.
or
I
follow
just
up to
had one-
that?
Just a follow
Sure.
up to that.
Yeah, go ahead.
So that money has been spent
It's in the process of
in the
being spent.
process. So there's no, if there's, I mean, we're only in October of the school year, and from teachers and EAs and counselors and everyone in the school, but they're all exhausted already. But if there's more money to be spent for COVID-related stuff in education, they do have a bit of wiggle room.
As I indicated in I guess an earlier answer, that's kind of the role of Treasury Board. Throughout the year, if what's in your plan is not exactly the way that it's unfolding for you in a department, there's opportunities for departments to come in and talk about how life is unfolding different than what we would have established in the budget. We did bake in, as I said, fairly significant contingencies within the budget that we have forecast within this budget to be spent. So we don't know what they are, but we like I say, we didn't want to take the money off the table for them right now. It's in their budget for the activities that may or may not show up.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Corey?
Thank you, Chair. With CERB ending, or has ended, have a lot of those people transitioned to unemployment? Is that
Would be a Nigel question.
sorry?
We believe so. I think these are federal programs transitioning to other federal programs. We were understanding that the intention was that with the reforms to EI, with the credit for the hours, I think 400 hours, 300 hours. You needed 120 hours to qualify, and right across the country it would be the shortest period to qualify for. That combined with the recovery benefit, the caregiver benefit, and the sick leave provisions, that very few, if anyone, would fall through the cracks. That was their intention. In just trying to understand if people were to fall through the cracks, they perhaps might end up in social services. And in discussions with that department, they've not seen a spike in applications.
Corey?
Okay, that's what I was curious of, if they have. Is there a concern that, like, it was $580 million that has been pumped in to the economy, I guess mostly through the federal government? Eventually that will run out, that's going to stop, that can't go on forever. Is there a concern, like, I know you're projecting GDP growth next year to be around 3.8% or a rebound. Are we kind of living in a, like, is that actually, when that money runs out and goes away, the wage subsidies, or even I guess unemployment, those benefits, is there a concern that, because a lot of people had money, there were some people that had 500, they were getting the 500 a week. Obviously a lot of people lost their jobs and they needed that, and that was just helping them get by. But it helped a lot of people, right? And they had some money in their pocket that they were able to spend, right? So that money was kind of circulating in the economy. Is there concern when that does all eventually stop that there might be it might hurt our economy?
Well, the reason, if you back up a little bit, the reason why we have these benefits is because of the response to the pandemic. So, ordering people to stay home, for businesses to shutter. If we want people in businesses to have a chance of respecting the orders, they do need some support. And the province provided up front some very quick and very nimble bridge benefits to when the federal programming kicked in relatively quick turnaround, early April. But between mid-March and early-ish April, the province helped fill the gaps and continues to fill gaps where appropriate. But when you get to, and it's the intention that of the 150 some odd potential vaccines and therapies under some level of study at this point, that maybe by, and this, I'm way out of my league here, but in the not too distant future, that a viable therapy or preventative measure will be available. And it will take some time to roll that out, but maybe by next spring, this will be maybe in some sense behind us. That does sound rather optimistic, but that there's a growing kind of view that might be what unfolds. Some of these benefits will go about that long, and if we it's really the transition from benefits back to a fully open economy. People are back, the restrictions on gatherings is lifted, so then you can have larger events. People want to get back to life. There'll be jobs hopefully to go to, and in the meantime, preserving people's ability to support themselves, so that they'll have something to kind of go back and participate in when the economy opens up. And similarly for businesses, that they can, like, this is a really rough time for them, but that they can, in some sense, kind of hold their breath long enough to get through it and open for a more normal season next year.
Corey?
Yeah, and a lot of that banks on the fact that they'll have a vaccine by January, and that by the spring that a significant amount of the population will have it. And hopefully that's the case. I think we're all crossing our fingers hoping so. So a lot of businesses probably right now are probably on life support. Like the wage subsidy keeps them going, they can keep employees. Do we have an idea of how many businesses have closed permanently that won't reopen due to the pandemic, or that could potentially would have to shut their doors for good if they didn't have some of these programs assisting them?
I'm not sure we have very solid information on how many would be closing permanently. There are some who've closed because it's just not viable right now, and in some cases that's the right decision. Just preserve what you have, and hopefully things open up sooner, maybe in the new year. But it's the holding your breath until things recover sufficiently to open. So we won't know the ultimately how much kind of economic destruction or businesses might kind of not survive. Probably until sometime next year, when things kind of open up, and if they were going to open, feel confident enough to have opened, if that was the plan.
Correct. Okay, Sonny?
Thank you. Thank you very much, gentlemen. And $2.3 billion is pretty big figures, and it's a lot of money, and I thank you for what you do with that. To Nigel's comments, I know the provincial government and the federal government were very good and in tandem with some assistance when this all started. But I just want to go back to PEI residents received about $265 million in this CERB program. So is this a fair question? But I'll ask it. Maybe you can't answer it, but in a normal season with EI and other benefits to islanders from the feds, where would that stand versus what the island would bring in on a normal time?
So that's about 6 months of pandemic, thereabouts. For an entire year, EI would have paid out approximately $250 million on PEI. So
Sunny?
And as far as the tourism, is there any thought or is there any thoughts or programs going forward to the businesses that didn't open this year to maybe help them next year reopen?
Not that I'm aware of. I think it is important, so on the business supports, so tourism would still be able to participate in the commercial rent program, which now has rolled over into a new more flexible rental support program for commercial operators. There's a range of supports that directly or indirectly help the business community, either directly or through helping them support employees that they hire.
Sunny?
Question, Chair. You had talked about lottery sales projection being higher than what you anticipated, liquor sales being a little higher. There was no mention of some other government agencies, like what about cannabis sales? What about CDBC revenue and things like that, like the Energy Corporation? Like, where are those projects stand, or those revenue sources stand?
I believe in the table that was in the information table with the legislature at the end of September, there was a financial snapshot for every one of those entities. I'll have to try to dig it out here. I didn't highlight them because, again, I was trying to focus in on those that were significant and not to get down into the minutiae of all of the variances. But every one of the government business enterprises were included within the document that was tabled in September.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Sunny. I just wanted to touch on a couple of things that were said. So, first of all, you had mentioned health and wellness and education and lifelong learning have started using their contingency funds. Is there any other departments that have also started using the contingency fund?
We had some assistance in economic growth in tourism and some come forward for agriculture, I believe. I don't have the full list in front of me. There was probably 20% uptake on the first run of programs.
Okay.
That's something I guess we could bring back to you or send back to you if you were interested in what other programs had kind of been requested to date.
Okay, thank you for that. And also, of the programs that were launched, there was a number of them that would draw down over the course of the year. So is there any programs that the funding that was estimated in the estimates that would be required in order to operate the funds, is there any that stand out in your mind that actually have not drawn down on programming, or have they been?
Definitely in the slide that I kind of provided to the committee, the low income essential worker program at 16.7 didn't quite make it there. I think it was a few million short, probably about 4 million lower than we had anticipated. So that is kind of still available.
Yeah.
But not in its current form, because that current form kind of expired. Run went out to the employers to request who might be available for that program, and that program essentially is closed, but it wasn't fully subscribed. The workspace adaptation program, I think by the time we had that established, I think a lot of businesses had already gotten up and running, so perhaps the timing on that one wasn't exactly where we had anticipated. And those would be the two largest variances, I think, that would be within the 30 or so programs that were contained in the first run of the document.
Okay. And, I mean, we often don't have these contingency funds, right? So this is something that's very new to us. So How will that be reported on? So, for instance, when the actuals come forward at the end of the year, when we see, like the updates, will the contingency fund remain separated so that that'll be shown?
Yeah, we put a reasonable amount of thought into how to reflect the contingency. I'll be honest, the first run of it, because we didn't know when the legislature was going to sit, the special warrant and what's contained in general government, I'd call that first run particularly clunky.
Yeah.
Because it's a big bucket of money with all 30 or so programs in it. But that sort of activity was already in motion by the time the budget was being contemplated. The second run and the second sort of restart funds, if you want to call it, or contingencies, we have a separate line in each department that get allocated that. So there will be funds in that bucket against that line when the next run of reporting comes for the third quarter forecast, when we have a little more, a few more months underneath our belt, and some of the activities have been determined and defined.
Okay. And can we anticipate that the COVID contingency will remain separated? Because I guess I think when we look at future years, right, and we compare year over year, you're constantly going to have to normalize for COVID, right? Like that's going to be something that we're going to see for the next, 2, 5, 10 years. So will you be, when you are reporting back on it, separating that out so that normalization can happen easier?
And I think, like, hindsight's a wonderful thing, but definitely the spot that we have it in general government and didn't disperse the first run in 30 programs out to departments will aid in that for sure.
Yeah. In
that we have a fairly centralized location to normalize, and the fact that we added a separate line for COVID contingencies departments will also assist in normalizing that, so we didn't kind of disperse the activities throughout the organization to then try to normalize it, as you say, and say what's a normal year look like in the next year. Now, as I said, with not so many data points behind us, I'm not sure what normal will look like going into the future, but definitely in a historical perspective, I think we will be able to report a little separately on some of this, as was done in May when we kind of brought the COVID document to the legislature and had a fairly fulsome debate on some of those first run of 30 or so programs.
Okay, thank you for that. I have a question on a issue of Treasury notes that was completed this year. So the Minister of Finance authorized to borrow up to $900 million by issuing Treasury notes on behalf of the province for a period not exceeding 12 months. Can you give me some background on that and what prompted that issuance?
Sure. So the province raises funds in two manners. Long-term debt, which has a fairly prescriptive process for it. A loan act would come to the legislature for the expected future borrowings for the province. When we execute a particular debenture or a loan, we would be reporting back then through Executive Council and through an order in council on that loan going out the door. Second part is more on a day-to-day, making sure that there's cash in the bank. Revenues come in big pieces. They don't come in equally throughout the year. Like payroll happens every second Thursday. So I have a run of expenses that are fairly predictable mostly. So to cash flow the province, we would issue some short-term debt in the form of Treasury notes. So every Tuesday we would run an auction on what our expected cash flow requirements are for the province to make sure that we have cash on hand to pay the bills. And every Tuesday we retire some debt and get some new debt so that on any given day we are running some short-term debt to fund our cash flow. Early on in the pandemic, credit markets were tight. The availability of cash was not guaranteed. So we, through the Minister of Finance, requested an increase to our available pool of funds that we could borrow so that we would have the necessary reserves on hand to fund government operations, because if we don't have the money to pay the bills, then the whole economy can kind of be shut down. So we saw it as very much a preventative measure to make sure that we had enough fiscal capacity to keep the engine running.
Okay. And I appreciate that. And I probably should know this number, but in a typical year, what would that normally look like?
We had 700 million and we were running on about below 500 million.
Okay.
In the beginning of the pandemic, we sort of ramped that up a little bit, so we're carrying about 780 million now.
Okay.
720 to 780, and that's kind of a rolling number for us now, so we'll retire some and place some more notes in mostly 90-day variety.
Okay.
And that's would just have some cash around. We have a fairly significant reserve of cash set aside, actually earning a little more money than we're actually borrowing it at. So it's turned out to be a reasonable program for us.
Okay, thank you. And I just have two more questions. So on the projected versus actual employment rate, you showed, Nigel, that it had come up higher than what was anticipated in the original forecast. Do you have any idea, was that full-time hours, or was there any numbers within there that would show, yes, it came up, however, you know, that person was working 20 hours a week, but they were still employed, so therefore they would be included in that employment rate. So I'm just wondering if you have any ideas to if there was reduced hours versus if it had been full-time before.
It wouldn't, it's a labor force definition, so it's being employed. Now, whether you're full or part-time, it still counts as being employed. But it didn't break it down into people who might be
Okay.
normally working full-time, now working part-time. We wanted to try our best to get kind of what the total level of employment might look like before kind of drilling down into, well, is it full or part-time?
Right. I guess it's just because there's a big difference there, right? So if you had X percentage of those as full-time positions before, and now, 50% of them are actually part-time hours because of what's going on in the economy. That's a very, I think, different picture than if we were right back up to all of those full-time positions being full-time versus a change in hours. So it's just interested in that. And then I'll ask the final question. The $4.7 million that was allocated to the PEI Potato Board, and that is a monthly drawdown. Can you tell me how much has been drawn down on that?
I don't have the numbers specifically in front of me to the last month, but that would be one of the programs that's not fully subscribed.
Okay.
I think they're getting close back to pretty normal operations out there right now, so I want to say maybe 50%, but I can definitely send that number back as well.
Okay, because I was interested, you had mentioned the manufacturing piece, there was not as much impact from the manufacturing component, which is mostly food, which is where that one would have fallen in, I would assume. So I'd love to see those numbers, yeah. I don't have any further questions. Does any other committee members have further questions? So I think it's fair to take that advice where, the motion had stated September 30th, but that wasn't actually a full 6 months. I recognize within the finance world, we look at quarterly, 6 months, et cetera. So I think that's a good takeaway for us going forward. So I appreciate you pointing that out. And again, I really say kudos to your staff, because I know that this has been an exceptionally difficult year. So thank you very much for your presentation today. Did you have any closing remarks that you'd like to leave us with, or no? You don't have to. No. That's great. Thank you so much. We're just going to recess for 2 minutes. All right, so we will resume the Standing Committee on Public Accounts. We will move on to item number 5, which is review of correspondence. We do have 4 letters in front of us. There is a response from Brad Cowell on the contaminated sites update. And we sent that out to them. I don't believe there's been a response on that, has there, Ryan? Not yet.
No, that is the response.
Oh, that's response, I'm sorry. Okay, so based on the response, is there what further action would the committee like to take? Corey?
I think it's fine. I think the letter they provided is sufficient.
Okay. Any other discussion on it? Okay, so will we, do we agree no further action on that piece? Okay, okay. There's an October 21st letter from Cindy Harris, and that is an update on the implementation of the recommendations from the 2020 audit of IT access controls, security access controls. And so that's the response. And she said, I can report that 28% of the AG's recommendations have been completed. Would we like to take any further action on that at this point in time?
Maybe just follow up in the new year. If she mentioned
Okay.
they'll have more, they anticipate more to be completed by year end.
Okay, so would everybody be okay just requesting a further update after year end? Okay, that'd be great. This third letter is from David Keedwell. We had them present today, but that is the correspondence that we received prior to their presentation today. And we've already documented actions from that. Is there any further actions that we'd like to discuss today on that one? Okay, and then October 23rd, we received a letter from Kent McDonald, CEO of Tourism PEI, with the updates on the 2019 audit of capital asset plan for provincial parks. We'll open up to discussion on that. I know there's a lot of discussion around COVID planning and the impacts to tourism as a whole. So is there further action that we would like to take at this point in time? Sid? You're satisfied? Okay, any other discussion? Okay, so at this point in time, we will wait. And that is 2019. I'm doing it in my head. So there will be a follow-up starting next year anyway from the Auditor General. So would the committee like to wait for the Auditor General's first follow-up? Okay, thank you. So we'll wait until the Auditor General does their first follow-up on that one. Okay, any other correspondence that anybody's received to review? So we have review of scheduling next. I know that we have a meeting next week, Ryan. No, we don't.
No. The next meeting is November 10th.
And that is the scheduled training on the public accounts. So again, that's a public meeting that will be held here. Yeah, I don't have any further. So I guess we'll go to new business. Is there any new business that anybody would like to bring forward? No. I'll just mention, so end of last week, I did attend the Westminster, there was a financial oversight workshop out of the UK, and I did attend that, and it was a really good session. And as part of that session, they actually pointed to the actions that this committee had taken, to document our mandate and the statement of purpose and values. And I just wanted to provide feedback that I had received from that is a number of public accounts committees are looking at that action that we had taken from across, the practice through Westminster public accounts committees. And so I just wanted to feed that back to the members of this committee, that it's something that other committees are talking about based on our action. So I think that that was a really good step for us to take based on what we had learned. And I guess what I kind of put forward, we talked about how do you build consensus. And I'd just like to recognize this committee as being a committee that has worked really well together and has maintained that mandate to work together in order to better look at the fiscal, the public accounts of the province. So I just wanted to recognize everybody for that and say thank you. It's a pleasure to be the chair of this committee. So based on that, we have nothing else on the agenda, so I'll ask for a motion to adjourn. So be it. Carla, thank you.